The morning briefing started at 0600 sharp, but Jessica Martinez had been awake since 4. She stood at the edge of Forward Operating Base Kestrel, watching the sun bleed orange across the Afghan mountains, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The base hummed with its usual pre-dawn rhythm generators churning, radios crackling, boots on gravel as the night shift handed over to day crews. Jessica had been stationed here for 8 months, and every morning felt the same. She was invisible. At 24, she stood barely 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed maybe 120 pounds soaking wet. Her fellow soldiers called her Pocket behind her back, though never with malice. She was the kind of person who fixed things quietly, who knew where every piece of equipment was stored, who could strip and rebuild a helicopter engine blindfolded. But when it came to the real missions, the ones that mattered, she was always left behind. The briefing tent buzzed with anticipation as she slipped inside. Maps covered every surface, red pins marking hostile territories, blue lines tracing flight paths. Major Bradley Collier stood at the front, his weathered face serious as he addressed the assembled crew. Jessica found a spot near the back, her notebook ready, though she already knew what was coming. Today's extraction mission is codenamed Nightfall, Collier announced, his voice carrying the weight of command. We've got a recon team pinned down in Sector 7. Heavy enemy presence, difficult terrain. I need my best people on this one. Jessica's pen hovered over her notepad as Collier began reading names. Walker, your lead pilot. Rodriguez, you're his co-pilot. Thompson, you're on the door gun. Peterson, you handle the winch. The names continued, each one a small knife twist in Jessica's chest. She'd trained alongside these men for months, had outscored most of them in technical evaluations, could navigate terrain maps better than anyone in the unit. But when the real missions came up, she was always assigned to logistics support. Martinez, Collier's voice cut through her thoughts. You're on equipment manifest. Make sure everything's accounted for when the birds return. Equipment manifest. Again. Jessica nodded curtly, her jaw tight. Around her, the selected crew members exchanged grins and fist bumps. She might as well have been furniture. As the briefing dispersed, she caught fragments of conversation that made her stomach churn. Good thing Martinez isn't flying with us. Thompson muttered to Rodriguez. No offense, but I wouldn't trust someone that's small to haul me out of a hot zone. She's tough, I'll give her that, Rodriguez replied. But there's tough and there's physics. If I'm going down, I want someone who can actually carry me. Jessica pretended not to hear, but the words burned. She'd heard variations of this conversation dozens of times. Too small. Too weak. Too much of a liability. It didn't matter that. She could run a 6-minute mile or do more pull-ups than half the men in her unit. When it came to the dangerous work, she was always deemed insufficient. The worst part was that she understood their reasoning. In a life-or-death situation, physical strength mattered. But it wasn't everything, and she'd never been given the chance to prove that her intelligence, her determination, her absolute refusal to quit might be worth more than raw muscle. As the crew prepared for departure, Jessica walked to the equipment storage area and pulled out her personal gear. Hidden beneath regulation items was a detailed topographical map she'd been working on for weeks. Every night after her official duties ended, she studied satellite imagery, weather patterns, and terrain reports. She'd memorized every ridge, every valley, every potential landing zone within a 50-mile radius. Nobody had asked her to do this. Nobody knew she was doing it. But Jessica had learned long ago that being ready for opportunity was the only way to create it. The helicopters lifted off at 0-7-30, their rotors thundering across the base as they disappeared into the morning sky. Jessica stood on the tarmac, watching until they were just specks against the mountains, then turned back to her, Assigned duties. She had manifest to update, equipment to inventory, and a growing sense that today would be different. She just didn't know how different yet. 3 weeks had passed since the Nightfall mission, a successful extraction that had earned the crew commendations and Jessica another day of updating equipment logs. She'd watched the celebration from across the mess hall, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to ignore the familiar ache in her chest. The whispers had started immediately after their return. Not about the mission itself, but about her. Jessica first noticed it during the equipment debrief, when Sergeant Williams asked her to verify the inventory counts. Simple enough, except his tone carried an edge she hadn't heard before. "You sure about these numbers, Martinez?" Williams had asked, tapping the clipboard with his pen. "Because if there's gear missing, it's going to be a problem." Jessica had double-checked everything twice. The numbers were correct, as they always were. But Williams' doubt planted a seed that began to grow throughout the base. Soon, other small incidents followed. Her maintenance reports were questioned more thoroughly. Her equipment requests took longer to process. During physical training, she caught sidelong glances when she outperformed expectations, as if her competence was somehow suspicious. The breaking point came during a routine briefing about base security protocols. Jessica sat in her usual spot near the back, taking notes on new equipment check procedures, when she heard her name mentioned in a conversation 2 rows ahead. "I'm just saying, Martinez spends a lot of time studying those maps," Private Davis was whispering to his neighbor. "More than someone on logistics duty really needs to. What's that supposed to mean?" The other soldier replied, "Maybe nothing. But she's always asking questions about flight patterns, terrain conditions, stuff. That's not really her job. Makes you wonder what she's really up to." Jessica's pen stopped moving. She stared at the back of Davis's head, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. Her dedication to understanding the area of operations, something that made her better at her job, was being twisted into something questionable. After the briefing, she cornered Davis near the supply depot. "Is there something you want to say to me directly?" she asked, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. Davis looked uncomfortable, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Look, Martinez, I didn't mean anything by it. It's just, you have to admit, you're pretty intense about stuff that's not exactly your specialty." "My specialty is keeping this unit equipped and ready," Jessica replied. "That means understanding what you might need and where you might need it. I'm sorry if my thoroughness makes you uncomfortable. Hey, don't get defensive. I'm just saying, maybe you should focus on what you're actually assigned to do instead of trying to play soldier." The words hit like a physical blow. Jessica had spent 8 months proving herself, had earned respect through competence and dedication, and now that was being questioned because she cared too much about doing her job well. She walked away without another word, but the damage was done. Over the following days, she noticed more changes. Her suggestions during briefings were met with polite dismissal. Her requests for additional training were quietly denied. Even her friend Rachel, one of the few other women on the base, seemed to be keeping her distance. The isolation grew worse when Major Collier called her into his office for what he termed a performance review. Jessica sat across from his desk. Her service records spread out between them like evidence in a trial. "Martinez, you're technically proficient," Collier began, his fingers drumming against the desk. "Your attention to detail is ... comprehensive. But there have been some concerns raised about your focus." "What kind of concerns, sir?" "The kind that suggest you might be more interested in duties outside your assigned role. I need to know that my logistics personnel are focused on logistics, not distracted by operations they're not qualified for." Jessica felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Sir, I've never neglected my assigned duties. My performance reviews have been consistently excellent. That's not the issue. The issue is scope. You're studying terrain maps, flight patterns, extraction procedures, all things that fall outside your area of responsibility. It's creating questions about your intentions. My intentions are to be the best soldier I can be, sir. To be ready for whatever the mission requires. Collier leaned back in his chair, studying her with eyes that seemed to weigh her worth. The mission requires you to track equipment, Martinez. Nothing more. I'm going to need you to scale back the extracurricular activities. Focus on what you're here for. Jessica left the office feeling like she'd been punched in the gut. Her dedication was being treated as a character flaw, her preparation as potential insubordination. She was being systematically pushed into a smaller and smaller box, told to limit herself to the narrow role others had decided she was suited for. That night, she sat in her quarters staring at the detailed map she'd been working on. Months of careful study, notes on weather patterns, elevation charts, potential hazards, all of it dismissed as inappropriate ambition. She thought about putting them away, about accepting the limitations others had placed on her. Instead, she folded them carefully and tucked them into her personal gear. If today had taught her anything, it was that being ready wasn't just about opportunity, it was about survival. The call came in at 11:43 on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other. Jessica was updating inventory logs in the supply depot when the emergency klaxon shattered the routine quiet of the base. She dropped her clipboard and ran toward the command center, her heart hammering against her ribs. The radio chatter was chaotic, filled with static and overlapping voices. Through the noise, she caught fragments that made her blood turn cold. Black Hawk down, Sector 7, pilot unconscious. No secure landing zone. Jessica pushed through the gathering crowd of personnel until she could see the command center's main display. A red dot blinked on the digital map, marking the crash site in some of the most treacherous terrain in the region. She recognized the area immediately. She'd studied those ridges for weeks, knew every cliff face and hidden ravine. Major Collier stood at the center of the controlled chaos, his face grim as he coordinated the response. Walker, take Bird 2. And attempt extraction. Rodriguez, your backup. Peterson, prep the emergency medical equipment. Sir, Walker's voice crackled through the radio. The terrain's too steep for a safe approach. We can't get close enough for extraction. Then, find a way, Collier snapped. We've got a pilot down and a crew member injured. I need options. Jessica watched the satellite feed showing the crash site. The Black Hawk had gone down on a narrow ridge, its tail rotor caught in a cluster of rocks. The surrounding terrain was a nightmare of loose scree and vertical drops. But she'd studied this area extensively, knew there was a climbing route that could work if someone was willing to attempt it on foot. She stepped forward, her voice clear despite the chaos around her. Sir, I know that terrain. There's a route up the eastern face that could work for extraction. Collier turned, his expression shifting from intense focus to irritation. Martinez, this is not the time for, sir, I've mapped every ridge in Sector 7. The helicopter approach is impossible, but a ground extraction is feasible. The eastern face has a climbing route that leads directly to the crash site. Are you out of your mind? Thompson interjected. That ridge is 1,000 feet of vertical rock. Even if someone could climb it, they'd never make it back down with an injured pilot. I could make it, Jessica said quietly. The command center fell silent except for the static of radio communications. Every eye turned toward her, most filled with disbelief, others with something approaching pity. Collier's voice was dangerously quiet. Martinez, you're a logistics specialist. You're not qualified for search and rescue operations. I'm qualified to carry a 100-pound pack for 20 miles. I'm qualified to navigate terrain in zero visibility. I'm qualified to perform first aid under pressure. And I know that ridge better than anyone in this room. You're 5 feet tall, Walker's voice came through the radio. No offense, but physics doesn't care about your qualifications. Jessica felt the familiar burn of dismissal, but this time it was different. This time, there was a pilot dying on that ridge while everyone stood around debating whether she was strong enough to save him. "Sir," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system, "give me a chance. If I can't make the climb, you've lost nothing. If I can, you save a life." Collier studied her for a long moment, then shook his head. "Absolutely not. I won't risk losing another soldier on a suicide mission. We wait for the engineering unit to bring repelling equipment. They'll be here in 6 hours. 6 hours might be too long," Jessica pressed. "The pilot's unconscious, possibly suffering from head trauma. Every minute we delay reduces his chances of survival." "That's not your call to make, Martinez. You're dismissed." The words hit like a slap. Jessica stared at Collier, at the faces around her filled with doubt and dismissal, at the blinking red dot on the screen, representing a man who might die because she wasn't deemed worthy of trying to save him. She turned and walked out of the command center, her boots silent on the concrete floor. Behind her, the planning continued, filled with logistical complications and technological solutions that would take hours to implement. Hours that Pilot Jackson didn't have. In her quarters, Jessica sat on her cot and stared at her hands. Small hands, everyone always pointed out. Too small to carry a grown man. Too small to matter when lives were on the line. She thought about Jackson, whom she'd served with for 8 months. He'd never dismissed her, never made her feel small. He'd treated her like a soldier, like someone whose opinion mattered. And now he was dying on a ridge because she wasn't considered strong enough to try to save him. Jessica stood up and began gathering her gear. Not the standard equipment they'd eventually bring to the crash site, but the specialized climbing gear she'd been quietly accumulating for months. Gear that no one knew she had, because no one thought she'd ever need it. She'd spent 8 months being told she wasn't enough. Today, she was going to prove them wrong. Jessica waited until the base settled into its evening routine before making her move. The command center was still active, but most of the personnel had shifted to support roles, monitoring communications and coordinating with the engineering unit that wouldn't arrive until morning. She'd heard the latest updates. Jackson's vital signs were growing weaker, and the weather was deteriorating. She slipped out of her quarters with her pack loaded and her mind crystal clear. The route she'd memorized led through a service road that connected to the main supply depot, then branched into a maintenance trail that would take her to the base perimeter. She'd walked it dozens of times during her off-duty hours, timing herself, learning every shadow and blind spot. The first challenge came at the motor pool checkpoint. Sergeant Williams sat in the guard shack, his attention focused on a paperback novel. Jessica approached with her standard confident stride, clipboard in hand as if she was conducting a routine inspection. "Evening, Sergeant," she said, not slowing down. "Just checking the fuel levels on the backup generators." Williams glanced up, saw her logistics vest and familiar face, and nodded without interest. "Make it quick, Martinez. I'm not supposed to let anyone wander around after 2,000 hours." "Just need 5 minutes," she replied, already moving past the checkpoint. Her heart hammered, but her voice remained steady. 5 minutes was all she needed to reach the perimeter fence. The base security was designed to keep threats out, not to keep personnel in. Jessica found the maintenance gate she'd noticed weeks ago, partially hidden behind an equipment storage container. The lock was standard military issue, nothing that couldn't be bypassed with the right tools and enough patience. She worked quickly, her hand steady despite the adrenaline. The lock clicked open after 2 minutes of careful manipulation. She slipped through the gate and into the darkness beyond, knowing that she'd just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The hike to the crash site would take 4 hours through terrain that most people would consider impassable in daylight. Jessica had studied the route obsessively, memorizing every landmark, every potential hazard. She'd also prepared for the possibility that she might not make it back. In her pack, along with the climbing gear and medical supplies, was a letter addressed to her sister back in Texas. In it, she tried to explain why she'd made this choice, why she couldn't stand by and watch someone die when she might be able to help. The letter was probably unnecessary. She fully intended to return with Jackson, but it felt important to acknowledge the stakes. As she hiked through the darkness, Jessica's mind wandered to the conversation she'd overheard earlier between Thompson and Rodriguez. They'd been discussing contingency plans, speculating about how long Jackson might survive in the cold. Neither had mentioned the possibility of her unauthorized rescue attempt, because neither could conceive of her attempting something so far outside her assigned role. That was her advantage. Everyone at the base saw her as Logistics Martinez, the tiny woman who counted equipment and filed reports. They couldn't imagine her scaling a cliff face with an injured pilot on her back. Their dismissal had become her camouflage. The terrain grew increasingly difficult as she approached the crash site. The satellite imagery had shown her the general layout, but experiencing it firsthand was different. The ridge rose like a wall of broken stone, its surface carved by wind and weather into a maze of potential handholds and lethal drops. Jessica paused at the base of the cliff to check her equipment one final time. Climbing harness secured. Rope properly coiled and attached. Medical supplies easily accessible. Emergency beacon ready but not yet activated. She'd use it only if she succeeded in reaching Jackson to signal for helicopter extraction from the top of the ridge. The first 50 feet of the climb were the most technically challenging. The rock face was nearly vertical, with minimal handholds and loose stone that threatened to give way under her weight. Jessica climbed slowly, testing each grip, each foothold, never committing her full weight until she was certain the rock would hold. Her training kicked in, muscle memory from years of rock climbing that she'd pursued as a hobby, but never mentioned to her military colleagues. They saw her as too small for physical challenges, so she'd kept her strengths hidden. Now, those hidden skills were the difference between life and death. As she climbed higher, the wind picked up, carrying the sound of distant helicopter rotors. The search and rescue teams were still circling, still looking for a way to reach the crash site. Jessica wondered what they'd think when they discovered her absence, whether they'd assume she'd simply wandered off, or whether they'd piece together what she was actually attempting. It didn't matter. She was committed now, suspended between the ground and the sky, with nothing but determination and carefully planned preparation to bridge the gap. Above her, somewhere in the darkness, Jackson was waiting for someone to prove that size doesn't determine strength. Jessica looked up at the remaining climb and smiled grimly. Time to show them what too small could accomplish. The wind intensified. As Jessica reached the halfway point of the cliff face, carrying with it the acrid smell of burning fuel and twisted metal. She could see the crash site now, a dark scar against the ridgeline where the Black Hawk had carved its violent path through rock and scrub. The sight filled her with renewed urgency. Her hands were raw inside her gloves, and her shoulders screamed from the constant strain of supporting her body weight. But she'd trained for this, had pushed herself through countless hours of preparation that no one knew about. Every pull-up in the base gym, every mile run before dawn, every night spent studying topographical maps, it all came down to this moment. The radio chatter in her earpiece had grown increasingly frantic. Base Command was coordinating multiple search efforts, but they were all ground-based approaches that would take hours to organize. time that Jackson didn't have. "Martinez, respond," came Major Collier's voice, sharp with authority and growing concern. "Martinez, if you can hear this, return to base immediately. That's a direct order." Jessica switched off her radio. She'd known this moment would come, when her absence would be discovered and her actions would be considered insubordination. But she'd also known that some things were more important than following orders, especially when those orders meant watching someone die. The final ascent to the crash site tested every skill she'd developed. The rock face transitioned from vertical to an overhanging ledge that required her to climb horizontally for nearly 20 feet. Her core strength, built through years of functional fitness training, kept her pressed against the stone as she worked her way across the treacherous span. When she finally pulled herself onto the ridge, Jessica allowed herself 30 seconds to catch her breath. The crash site was worse than the aerial photographs had suggested. The helicopter's main rotor had sheared off completely, and the fuselage was twisted like a broken toy. But she could see movement near the wreckage. Jackson was alive. She approached carefully, her medical training taking over. Jackson was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. The head wound had left blood matted in his hair, and his left leg was bent at an unnatural angle. But his pulse was strong, and his airway was clear. Jessica worked quickly, stabilizing his neck and checking for internal injuries. The head trauma was her primary concern. She needed to get him to medical attention as soon as possible. The broken leg would have to wait. The extraction harness she'd brought was designed for this situation, though she'd never used it in a real rescue. She'd practiced with it dozens of times, using sandbags and equipment to simulate an unconscious patient. Now, working with Jackson's limp form, she discovered that reality was both harder and easier than her training had suggested. Harder because Jackson was dead weight, his body offering no assistance as she maneuvered him into the harness. Easier because her preparation had been thorough, and muscle memory guided her through the complex process of securing straps and checking connections. The descent would be the most dangerous part. Jessica had to lower Jackson first, controlling his movement with a complex belay system that required her to remain at the top of the ridge until he was safely on the ground. Only then could she rappel down herself. As she prepared the rope system, her radio crackled back to life. She turned it on to monitor base communications, not to respond to them. "All units, be advised we have a heat signature on the ridge," came a voice she didn't recognize. "Someone's at the crash site." Jessica smiled grimly as she checked Jackson's harness one final time. Let them wonder. In 20 minutes, she'd have Jackson on the ground and ready for helicopter extraction. The base would have to acknowledge that their logistics specialist had accomplished what their entire search and rescue operation couldn't. She activated her emergency beacon, sending a signal that would guide the rescue helicopters to her exact location. Then she began the careful process of lowering Jackson down the cliff face, her hands steady on the rope despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. Below her, Jackson's form disappeared into the darkness. Above her, the sound of approaching helicopters grew louder. Jessica checked her watch right on schedule. She'd planned for this moment for months, had prepared for variables that others couldn't imagine. Now all she had to do was get both of them safely to the ground. The rescue helicopter appeared through the mountain haze like a mechanical angel, its searchlight cutting through the darkness to illuminate Jessica's position on the ridge. She'd just finished lowering Jackson to a secure ledge 50 feet below and was preparing for her own descent when the aircraft's powerful beam found her. Captain Williams' voice crackled through the aircraft's external speakers, amplified over the rotor noise. "Martinez, remain in position. We're bringing you up." Jessica keyed her radio, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. "Negative. Lower the basket for the pilot first. He needs immediate medical attention." There was a pause. Then William's voice returned, carrying a tone of disbelief. "Martinez, did you carry him up there alone?" "I carried him down," Jessica replied, watching as the rescue basket descended toward Jackson's position. "He's stabilized but needs to reach medical facilities as soon as possible." The basket reached Jackson's ledge, and Jessica guided the rescue crew through the extraction process via radio. She'd immobilized his neck and documented his injuries, information that would be crucial for the medical team. As Jackson was lifted toward the helicopter, Jessica allowed herself the first moment of relief she'd felt in hours. "Your turn, Martinez," Williams called. "The basket's coming back down." Jessica secured her climbing gear and prepared for extraction. As the basket lifted her toward the helicopter, she caught sight of additional aircraft approaching from the direction of the base. Word of her unauthorized rescue had clearly spread. Inside the helicopter, the medical team was already working on Jackson. His vital signs had stabilized during the transport, and the lead medic gave Jessica a thumbs up as she was pulled into the aircraft. She'd made the right call. Another hour of waiting would have been too long. "Martinez," Williams said through the intercom, "you've got some explaining to do." Jessica nodded, too exhausted to feel anything but relief. Jackson was alive, and that was what mattered. The consequences she'd face for her actions seemed insignificant compared to the alternative. The flight back to base took 12 minutes. Jessica spent the time documenting Jackson's condition and her treatment decisions, knowing that every detail would be scrutinized in the inevitable investigation. She'd broken numerous regulations, ignored direct orders, and put herself at considerable risk. But she'd also saved a life. As the helicopter settled onto the base landing pad, Jessica could see the crowd that had gathered. Major Collier stood at the front, his expression unreadable. Behind him, she recognized faces from her unit, some showing concern, others displaying the skepticism she'd grown accustomed to. The medical team rushed Jackson toward the base hospital, and Jessica found herself standing alone on the tarmac, facing a semicircle of officers and enlisted personnel. The silence stretched until Collier stepped forward. "Martinez," he said, his voice carrying across the landing pad, "you were ordered to remain on base." "Yes, sir," Jessica replied, her shoulders straight despite her exhaustion. "You ignored that order and conducted an unauthorized rescue operation." "Yes, sir." "You put your own life at risk without proper authorization or backup." "Yes, sir." Collier studied her for a long moment, then asked the question that hung in the air like smoke from the helicopter's engines. "How did you know you could make that climb?" Jessica looked at the faces around her, at the colleagues who'd dismissed her for months, who'd seen her as too small, too weak, too insignificant to matter when lives were on the line. "I prepared for it, sir. I studied the terrain, developed the skills, and acquired the equipment. I was ready." "Why?" The question came from Thompson, who'd been one of her loudest critics. "Why go to all that trouble for something that wasn't your job?" Jessica's answer was simple and honest. Because someone's life might depend on it. Someone's life did depend on it. The crowd began to murmur, but Collier raised a hand for silence. "Martinez, report to my office at 0800 hours. We'll discuss your future with this unit." As the crowd dispersed, Jessica walked toward the medical facility to check on Jackson. She'd face whatever consequences came from her actions, but first she needed to know that her risk had been worth it. The duty nurse informed her that Jackson was stable and would make a full recovery. As Jessica turned to leave, she found Rachel waiting in the corridor. "I heard what you did," Rachel said quietly. "Everyone's talking about it. And what are they saying?" Jessica asked. Rachel smiled. "They're saying that maybe size doesn't matter as much as they thought." Jessica stood outside Major Collier's office at exactly 0800 hours. her uniform crisp, despite the fact that she'd slept less than 3 hours. The events of the previous day felt surreal. The climb, the rescue, the return to base as a hero and a criminal all at once. Through the partially open door, she could hear voices engaged in heated discussion. She recognized Collier's gravelly tone, but there were others present voices that carried the authority of higher command. ... Complete disregard for protocol ... saved a man's life. ... in single quotes deciding which orders to follow ... Exactly the kind of initiative we need ... Jessica straightened her shoulders and knocked on the doorframe. Sir. Specialist Martinez reporting as ordered. Enter, Collier's voice commanded. Jessica stepped into the office to find herself facing a tribunal of sorts. Besides Collier, there were 2 other officers present, Colonel Richards from Base Command and Lieutenant Colonel Hayes from the Inspector General's office. Their expressions ranged from stern to openly curious. Martinez, Collier began, you're here because your actions yesterday created a significant problem for this command. You disobeyed direct orders, violated base security protocols, and conducted an unauthorized mission that could have resulted in your death. Yes, sir, Jessica replied, keeping her voice steady. However, Colonel Richards interjected. You also saved the life of a fellow soldier using skills and preparation that far exceeded your assigned duties. The question we're here to address is whether you're a disciplinary problem or an underutilized asset. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes leaned forward, consulting a file that Jessica assumed contained her complete service record. Specialist Martinez, can you explain why you felt authorized to ignore direct orders from your commanding officer? Jessica had rehearsed this moment in her mind throughout the sleepless night. Sir, I believed that Pilot Jackson would die if I didn't act. I had the skills and knowledge necessary to reach him, and I believed that the potential benefit of saving his life outweighed the risks of my unauthorized action. That's not your decision to make, Hayes replied sharply. Military discipline exists for a reason. If every soldier decided for themselves which orders to follow, we'd have chaos, not an effective fighting force. With respect, sir, Jessica said, I didn't decide to ignore orders lightly. I spent months preparing for exactly this type of situation, hoping I'd never need to use those skills. When the situation arose, I was the only person on base who could reach Pilot Jackson in time to save his life. Collier shuffled through papers on his desk. Speaking of preparation, Martinez, your supervisors report that you've been studying materials and developing skills far beyond your assigned duties. Some have questioned whether this represents inappropriate ambition or poor focus. Jessica felt a familiar anger building but kept her voice controlled. Sir, I believe that being a good soldier means being prepared for whatever the mission requires. I studied terrain and developed climbing skills because I recognize that this base operates in mountainous terrain where those skills might be needed. But you're a logistics specialist, Hayes pointed out. Your job is to track equipment, not to conduct rescue operations. My job is to serve my country and my fellow soldiers to the best of my ability, Jessica replied. If that means expanding my capabilities beyond my assigned duties, then that's what I'll do. The room fell silent for a moment. Then Colonel Richard spoke, his tone more thoughtful than accusatory. Martinez, your actions were successful this time, but they could have easily resulted in 2 casualties instead of 1. How do you justify taking that risk? Jessica had known this question would come. Sir, I calculated the risks as carefully as I could. I had the training, the equipment, and the knowledge necessary to attempt the rescue. The alternative was to watch Pilot Jackson die while we waited for resources that might arrive too late. And if you had failed? Collier asked. If you had fallen during the climb, or if Jackson had died anyway. Then I would have failed attempting to save a life rather than succeeded at doing nothing, Jessica replied. I can live with the consequences of trying. I couldn't live with the consequences of not trying. The three officers exchanged glances, some form of silent communication passing between them. Finally, Colonel Richards spoke. Martinez, your actions represent both the best and worst of military initiative. You showed extraordinary courage and skill in saving a fellow soldier's life. But you also showed a concerning disregard for the chain of command and military discipline. Jessica's heart sank. She'd known this was coming, had prepared herself for court-martial, for discharge for the end of her military career, but she'd also known that she'd make the same choice again if faced with the same situation. However, Richards continued, after extensive discussion with base command and review of your service record, we've decided that your actions, while unauthorized, were ultimately in the best interests of the mission and your fellow soldiers. Jessica blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. Sir, you're being reassigned, Martinez. Effective immediately, you're being transferred to the Search and Rescue Division, where your unique combination of skills and initiative can be properly utilized. The words hit Jessica like a physical blow. Not punishment, but promotion. Not discharge, but recognition. She struggled to find her voice. Sir, I thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, Richard said with a slight smile. SAR is going to put you through the most intensive training program in the military. You'll learn skills that will make your unauthorized cliff climbing look like a leisurely hike. And you'll do it all while maintaining the highest standards of military discipline. I understand, sir. I hope you do, Martinez. Because the next time you decide to ignore orders, you better be damn sure you're right. 6 months later, Jessica stood in the same briefing room where she'd once been relegated to equipment manifests and ignored suggestions. But everything had changed. The search and rescue patch on her shoulder carried weight that her logistics insignia never had, and when she spoke, people listened. The terrain in Sector 12 is challenging but manageable, she told the assembled rescue team, pointing to the topographical display. The key is the approach angle. If we come in from the northeast, we can establish a secure belay point here, then work our way down to the crash site. Captain Williams, now her team leader, nodded approvingly. How long for the descent? 45 minutes to reach the survivors, another hour to prepare them for extraction, Jessica replied. Weather window gives us 3 hours before the storm system moves in. Acceptable margins, Williams concluded. Martinez, your lead on this one. Lead on this one. Jessica still felt a thrill at those words, even after dozens of successful missions. She'd proven herself time and again, but the validation never got old. As the team prepared for deployment, Jessica caught sight of a familiar figure entering the briefing room. Pilot Jackson, now fully recovered from his injuries, walked with only the slightest limp, a reminder of their shared experience on that ridge 6 months ago. Martinez, he called out, approaching her with a grin. Heard you're leading today's mission. That's right, Jessica replied, adjusting her gear. Try not to crash this time, Jackson. I'm getting too old to carry pilots down mountains. Jackson laughed, a sound that still amazed Jessica. For weeks after the rescue, he'd struggled with nightmares and survivor's guilt. The fact that he was back to flying, back to joking, felt like a victory almost as significant as the rescue itself. Actually, Jackson said, his tone growing serious, I wanted to thank you again. I know I've said it before, but I never properly expressed what you did for me up there. You don't need to, Jessica began. Yes, I do, Jackson interrupted. You saved my life when everyone else said it was impossible. But more than that, you changed how this entire base thinks about what's possible. You changed how I think about what's possible. He gestured toward the briefing room, where soldiers from various units were preparing for different missions. Half the people in this room have taken additional training because of what you did. They saw someone who refused to accept limitations, and it inspired them to push past their own. Jessica looked around the room and realized he was right. Thompson had completed advanced medical training. Rodriguez had learned technical climbing. Even Williams had expanded his skill set beyond his original specialty. Her unauthorized rescue had created ripples that extended far beyond that single night on the ridge. The best part, Jackson continued, is watching Major Collier try to take credit for recognizing your potential all along. Jessica smiled at that. Collier had indeed rewritten history in his own mind, now claiming that he'd always known she had exceptional capabilities. It was a small price to pay for the respect and opportunities that had followed. The mission alarm sounded, indicating it was time for deployment. Jessica shouldered her pack and headed toward the helicopter, her team falling in behind her. As they walked across the tarmac, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She was no longer the overlooked logistics specialist who counted equipment while others flew dangerous missions. She was rescue team leader Martinez, someone whose opinion mattered, whose skills were valued, whose determination had proven that size truly didn't determine strength. The helicopter lifted off into the afternoon sky, carrying Jessica and her team toward another rescue mission. As they flew over the same mountainous terrain where she'd once climbed alone in darkness, Jessica keyed her radio. "Base, this is Rescue Leader Martinez. We're en route to the crash site. Estimated time to target, 30 minutes. Copy that, Rescue Leader," came the reply from Base Command. "Be advised, weather conditions are deteriorating. You have a narrow window." "Understood, Base. We'll bring them home." Jessica settled back in her seat and watched the mountains roll past below. Somewhere down there, survivors were waiting for rescue, counting on her team to reach them when conventional wisdom said it couldn't be done. She smiled and checked her equipment one final time. After all, proving conventional wisdom wrong had become her specialty. The radio crackled with an update from the crash site. 2 survivors confirmed, one with serious injuries. Time was critical, conditions were challenging, and success was far from guaranteed. In other words, it was exactly the kind of mission that everyone would have said was impossible for someone like Jessica Martinez just 6 months ago. She was looking forward to proving them wrong again. As the helicopter banked toward the target coordinates, Jessica thought about the letter she'd written to her sister that night before her unauthorized rescue mission, the one she'd never needed to send. In it, she'd tried to explain why some things were worth the risk, why proving yourself sometimes meant defying the people who claimed to know your limitations. Now, 6 months later, she understood that the real victory wasn't just in saving Jackson's life. It was in changing the conversation about what was possible, about who deserved opportunities, about the difference between following orders and serving a larger purpose. The crash site came into view ahead, another impossible rescue waiting to become routine. Jessica keyed her radio and began coordinating the approach, her voice calm and professional as she guided her team toward another group of people who needed someone to believe that impossible wasn't permanent. "Team, we're beginning our descent. Remember, we go in together, we work together, we come out together. No one gets left behind." "Copy that, Leader," came the chorus of responses. Jessica smiled as the helicopter touched down. Some days, being too small to matter meant being exactly the right size to make all the difference. The mission was just beginning, but she already knew how it would end, with everyone coming home safely, because that's what happened when people stopped accepting limitations and started exceeding expectations. Just like she'd learned to do, one impossible rescue at a time. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our everyday life stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.